Imagine a city center. It's longer than 3 football fields. It has a 2-story shopping promenade, a Broadway theater, a bowling alley, a water park, and an F1 simulator. After seeing a show, you can choose between dozens of restaurants, 20 bars and lounges, and maybe hit the thermal spa after. And you'll never get bored with nightlife options ranging from karaoke to comedy to live music to techno parties. Also, there's a dead 40-foot whale in the center of town, and you're floating in the Atlantic Ocean. Because, my friend, you're not in a city. You're on a boat, motherfucker, take a look at me. Now, for those of you not living large off investments you made in the 80s, we're talking about the cruise ship industry, worth $8 billion and growing, which annually takes nearly 32 million passengers around the world. Now, while we could spend a full video just analyzing the outfits, all-you-can-eat buffets, or luxury accommodations at these ships, we're going to look at just how weird and messed up the cruise industry is. And we're going to see if understanding the favorite retirement activity of boomers can actually explain precisely why it feels like the future is so screwed up for the rest of us. We're going to focus on Caribbean cruises, which constitute about half the global market. And to understand why something that seems so festive could be so sinister, we gotta look at how it all started. Now, credit for that goes to Frank Fraser, seen in this picture, giving out a little stern dick energy towards Princess Margaret. I once watched a few episodes of The Crown. I think she was like the fun one, but then I wasn't allowed to watch The Crown anymore because my wife was watching it, and it was an episode where some Irish people maybe did a thing to some British people, and I got really excited because I was cheering them on, and then she was like, "You're not supposed to cheer them on," and I was like, "Damn right I'm supposed to cheer them on." And I think she just realized that I was going to be rooting against the main guys on The Crown the whole time, hoping that the Irish did more stuff. Now, Fraser's Scottish ancestors settled in colonial Jamaica, where they took ownership of several citrus and banana plantations, according to journalist Christopher A. Garin. Fraser, a blustery colonial aristocrat, inherited a thriving export business, but by the 1940s he had different aspirations, turning the then podunk town of Miami, Florida, into the capital of a year-round pleasure cruise industry. Until this point, most cruises left out of the blustery Northeast. Now, Fraser was friends with infamously brutal Dominican Republic dictator General Rafael Trujillo, who chartered him a big passenger ship, allowing him to launch a Miami cruise line that offered air-conditioned tropical excursions, turning boat travel from something to be endured into something to be enjoyed. Fraser would also go into brief exile for clandestinely dealing Canadian arms to Trujillo because he had a lot of hobbies, like dealing Canadian arms. It's not surprising that a colonial heir established the modern Caribbean cruise ship industry, because according to many scholars, you can trace the region's tourism straight back to colonization, especially to the good old United States, which seized land in 1903 to construct the Panama Canal, a deadly but world-changing project that transformed the Caribbean and the American imagination, from a disease-ridden danger zone to a wealthy tourist health resort, ripe for tropical exploration. Later, Prohibition spurred a new wave of tourists who really needed a stiff drink. You heard that right, people needed the sauce so much they had to travel to another country just to get a drink. Elites could cruise the American Express Millionaires Cruise, while $50 whoopee cruises were more the norm. Clearly sounds like a cruise that you go on to do sex. And the Caribbean islands would adapt to the needs of its northern explorers, including building out a lively vice-ridden nightlife scene to the dismay of many locals. Now, between the world wars, the Lost Generation's traveling writers further romanticized tropical travel, awakening wanderlust that would launch 1,000 hairiest chess competitions. But the arrival of commercial air travel dealt a blow to the cruise industry. No longer essential, boat travel had to reinvent itself, with an emphasis on enjoying the journey. And Fraser's prediction would prove true. Miami emerged as the ideal launch point for Caribbean-bound pleasure cruises, and by the late 60s, we started seeing today's major cruise lines forming. Meanwhile, the Caribbean was regrouping as countries began to gain independence from colonial control and remake their economies. But thanks to a number of unfavorable economic conditions, the tourism industry was the most accessible source of growth. Spurred on by loans from places like the World Bank, Caribbean countries invested in massive infrastructure projects to accommodate the desires of tourists. And these tourists were, whether they wanted to or not, about to change the region and in a lot of ways, the economy as a whole. And I'm going to tell you all about that, but first, I want to tell you about something that can change our economy as a whole, our Patreon community. Now, we really appreciate you just being here, watching our videos, taking the time to comment and everything like that. But if you want to go a step further, the best way that you can support us is by joining our Patreon. Now, when you do, you're going to get our videos early with no ads. We have extra podcast and video content. We have extra research deep dives. We have a monthly video series with clips that we couldn't put in the main videos. There's a podcast called Behind the Crack. I do a philosophy office hours thing. Lots of great stuff for you, including access to our Discord server. Now, if you are a little thin in the wallet and who hasn't been there, we do have a $1 level for folks who just want to throw us $1 a month to say thanks and support what we're doing. You know, it's like a quarter a video. So if you have it in you, it'd mean a lot to us. There's a link in the description, so check it out. Thanks for the time. And now let's get back to figuring out why cruises are not all fun in the sun. Okay, so both the cruise lines and the Caribbean were ready when a hit TV show, The Love Boat, came along in 1977. Basically serving as a commercial for cruises. Through the 80s, demand continued to outpace availability, and newer, bigger ships increased access for middle-class travelers. The cruise industry was still run by a few increasingly consolidated international companies. Frustrated that their tourism profits were going to foreign companies, Caribbean countries contemplated pooling resources to compete in sectors like air travel. But American politics and capital were too powerful, and its control over the region became entrenched. Caribbean countries tried to diversify their economies, but trading blocs like NAFTA made them uncompetitive in manufacturing and agriculture. By the 1990s, even countries that once resisted tourism had to embrace it as a last lifeline. Meanwhile, as ships got bigger, economies of scale made cruising increasingly accessible for the average American across the 90s, and none were more eager for adventure than newly middle-aged baby boomers. Now, today's tourists cruise on the biggest, glitziest ships of all time, like the new Icon of the Seas, which is 5 times the size of the Titanic. You know, if it goes down, that iceberg is gonna need to be at least 5 times as big. This thing is like a floating Mall of America that swallowed a Vegas casino and then added rock climbing walls and submarine trips, ice skating, a planetarium, art auctions, the last of which actually inspired some lawsuits. Personal recommendation, don't go on the submarine trip, you know, because that thing happened. You guys remember when that thing happened with the submarine? Wasn't good. They're basically contained cities, what some sociologists would describe as a total institution, given that, as scholar George Ritzer writes, passengers cannot leave the ship while at sea. They can only do what is available to them on board, and they can only consume when and what the ship offers. But these limitations aren't without their comforts. Scholar Melanie Bennett explains cruise ships as spaces designed to be experienced as a simulated, all-encompassing, vast interior. As passengers move from place to place, engaging with various sites on the ship, they encounter the spaces as if cocooned in a bubble that causes the exterior, natural world of the ocean to appear unthreatening and distant. But travelers don't only escape the turbulence of the ocean. They escape the anxieties and uncertainty of real life. Cruise ships function as what scholar Anna Klingman calls a choreographed environment at sea, where the predictability of reliable meal times meet the infinite possibilities of on-ship amusement. For scholar Arthur Berger, this makes them temporary floating utopias, where social strife is rendered invisible, and choice between the tiki bar and the English pub, the golf course and the bowling alley becomes the dominant cultural value. And this choice even extends to human relationships, because you can select your nightly dinner companions as easily as you choose between Michelin star French cuisine and a burger at Guy Fieri's burger joint. Now, this fosters what scholars Michael P. Vogel and Christina Oshman call informal, uncomplicated encounters that remain transitory and free from obligations and consequences. Thus, in journalist Ian Urbina's estimation, the cruise industry represents a kind of gentrification of the ocean. With ever more amenities and space, the contemporary cruise ship is increasingly billed as the destination in and of itself, most potently symbolized by the popular cruise to nowhere, which takes you to the high seas and nowhere else. But most cruises are going somewhere. Destination ports. While they have every incentive to keep you locked in the tiki bar, people do inevitably disembark. So what then? Well, as scholar Polly Petullo explains, they're funneled into duty-free shopping malls full of crappy food courts and international chain stores. It's like being on the ship, except not. And as anthropologist Chrstine Preble writes, these ports are deliberately undertaken to create safe and recognizable expressions of paradise, offering a safe experience, which means no hassling from locals, threats of insecurity, or illness while ashore. Even if you venture out of the portside mall, you'll find what Petullo calls accommodating ecological bubbles, supplied with maintained roads, electricity, telephones, sewage disposal, and clean water supply, the latter of which any locals don't actually have, as well as upgraded police, customs, and currency exchange services, all paid for by the taxation of locals and or the increment of monumental debt from foreign lenders. And once a small island country invests in a major port, they'll need to attract wealthy Western tourists if they want to pay back those debts. This renders Caribbean nations reliant on former colonizer countries while funneling money away from other government services like healthcare or public transit. Though cruise companies consistently tout the business they bring to port countries, they increasingly control the geographies the passengers access, according to sociologist Ian Mahoney. Most shore excursions are managed by 3 multinational companies that have private contracts with the major cruise lines, often with car rentals, taxis, helicopters, and tour operators all under the same roof. And they operate at a scale that local companies simply can't compete with. As a result, scholar Tom Barry notes, most tourists return home without ever having tasted local cooking or talked to an islander. But this might be exactly what tourists want. The effect of cruising through multiple countries means that, as Mahoney writes, there is little incentive to engage with these exotic cultures in any meaningful way. Mahoney adds that such engagement is often not even desired, with many passengers admitting that they don't want to witness the realities of Caribbean life if it means being reminded of poverty or other deprivation.
You are going to be fine if you remain in the port area to shop and browse around, but you do not want to wander off into Belize City on your own.
The result is that local economies endure all the burdens of immense tourist traffic without reaping much of the profits. The only economic benefits to host countries often come from harbor dues, dock labor, and some taxi services. And things are only going to get worse for local economies as cruises are increasingly investing in further insulating their designated tourist zones by buying or leasing land or even entire islands such that passengers never really set foot in the country. Typically, they fence off this land, hire security, and forbid nearly all locals from setting foot on it. Since 2019 alone, cruise lines have spent at least $1.5 billion to expand their Caribbean land ownership. In addition to offering the allure of exclusivity and safety, making them like the suburbia of the Caribbean, privatized land allow cruise lines to profit from every dime spent on and off the ship, while rendering some of the most desirable land and natural resources inaccessible to locals. And it further concentrates profits amongst the 3 multinational corporations who control around 75% of the global cruise ship market. Royal Caribbean's $37 billion market value is 3 times the size of the entire Bahamian economy. And this sort of corporate neocolonialism is less shocking when we remember that an actual plantation owner created the modern cruise industry. You know, it'd be like if Hannibal Lecter started at Delhi, you probably wouldn't really be shocked when you found out that your salami was human meat. Which is why scholar Ian Strong argues that there exists an inextricable relationship between paradise and plantation, because the economic and political dependency established during slavery and colonialism has been reproduced in the tourist industry. Cruise companies exploit Caribbean resources, while host countries who have invested heavily in tourism are at the mercy of cruise lines, who can easily cut their ports off. Meanwhile, on board and off, cruise ship passengers are kept in protective cocoons, a hyper-reality that produces bubbles of an ideal tropicality, as scholar Matthew Nelson puts it. The cruise experience simulates a vision of Caribbean paradise that belies the lived realities of the Caribbean people. But things get even worse, as the cruising boomers aren't only fueling neocolonialism, they're benefiting from a set of economic conditions that are going to make the rest of our futures anything but a carnival. And I'm going to tell you about it in a second, but first, I wanted to tell you about something exciting. Wisecrack is now on Spotify. You can watch our videos and listen to them on Spotify right now. So if you use Spotify, go follow our page there. There's a link in the description. Give us a review. It's a fun way to be able to listen to our stuff when you're on the go. And we're especially excited for folks in our lives, and yours maybe, who don't really go on YouTube but listen to podcasts and might like our stuff. So, you know, pick your favorite episode and send it over to one of your friends who avoids dealing with reality by constantly listening to podcasts. You all know the person, and you might even be that person. So Wisecrack on Spotify, check it out. But now let's figure out what reality actually lies beneath the cruise fantasy. If we use Ritzer's terminology, cruises are cathedrals of consumption, a term that also applies to places like Disney World and Las Vegas. Cathedrals of consumption are defined by both their enchantment, i.e. their ability to allure consumers to spend, and rationalization, i.e. their ability to create replicable, efficient, mass-produced services and experiences. This dichotomy can be seen in something like Carnival's annual purchase of 6.5 million pounds of chocolate just for its signature warm chocolate melting cake. This is both enchanting for your stomach and infinitely replicable. Cathedrals of consumption require spectacle, in the Debordian sense, to conceal the cold economic logic that fuels all that melting chocolate. One way they do this is by creating what Ritzer calls the loss of a sense of time and a dreamlike state in which the passage of time seems not to be occurring or not to matter. Sort of like how having your rum and coke poured by a robot mixologist can make the difference between Tuesday and Saturday feel irrelevant. In such an environment, consumption begins to fuse with identity. According to sociologist Stephen Miles, this functions as self-work, the way in which consumers use consumption to actively contribute to a sense of who they are and how it is they relate to the uncertain world around them. Which sounds like an apt description of boomers, a generation defined by a quest for identity that took them from this all the way to this.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And there's plenty to identify with in the cruise ship economy. Whether you're a semi-professional poker player or a professional buffet connoisseur, whether you take a nostalgic-themed flower power cruise to relive your glory days, or just straight up become a cruise person and start living on boats full time. The ease with which you can construct an identity through spending renders cruises what Bennett calls ideal spaces for fueling unreflexive consuming behaviors. And the centrality of consumption changes how people behave. According to anthropologist Tom Selwyn, tourism allows for the pursuit of immediate gratification to such an extent that it releases the tourist from social and moral constraints. The result is hedonism, or the unmitigated pursuit of pleasure. It's embodied by Carnival's Cheers drinks package, which offers a pretty astonishing 15 alcoholic drinks a day. No sharing is permitted. I'm sure some of you were like, I could do 2 of those a day. Good for you, I guess. You can also spend $4,500 on a bottle of wine or reserve an elite luxury suite that comes with Steinway pianos and a 24-hour butler. Now you almost wonder why the generation that loves cruises so much just happens to have all this money.
Simply put, as we get younger, we're taking away opportunity and prosperity from our youngest.
Well, hedonism is also on display in the notoriously bad behavior of cruise tourists, which has spawned a million online articles about deck seat hogging as the breakdown of the social contract. I was at a hotel once where people would save chairs in the morning by the pool by putting stuff on them. I thought it was really bad. If you've ever done that, defend yourself in the comments. There's quantitative validity to these reports of misbehavior. Ethics researcher Valerie A. Shepard found that statistically, cruising seems to elicit a utilitarian, hedonistic orientation on the part of some cruisers, especially in Caribbean-bound cruisers, who seem to feel less ethical obligation to others in the world. Certain corners of the internet are wallpapered with written and video testimonials of cruise passengers being absolute tools, and it's often boomers doing this. There are the non-violent but still kind of violent offenses, like the way passengers treat crew members who aren't native English speakers.
What crew members hate, quite rightly, is when passengers are like, you need to learn English. Your English is terrible.
Or weaponize cultural stereotypes.
And she asked my Colombian friend, she was like, oh, you done cocaine? Do you like cocaine? I bet you get some great cocaine.
There are the bizarre buffet habits, ranging from serving yourself with your hands.
Some people witnessed other passengers actually taking food with their hands from the buffet,
to just taking food off someone else's plate.
Another cruise passenger walked by, grabbed some of the French fries right off their plate, and walked away.
There's the, is this person an alien masquerading as human offenses, like leaving frozen margaritas in elevators, or playing your Bluetooth speaker over the poolside performers, or wearing a thong bikini to the main dining room.
I've actually seen people show up with thong bikini bathing suits, both men and women, for dinner.
And then, of course, there are the all-out brawls that break out where ships descend into some sort of violent anarchy. These kinds of transgressions led Carnival Cruise to issue a recent plea to passengers saying, "We want you to have a fun vacation, but please remember, a cruise ship is a shared space." And of course, the cruise industry also shares space with the world. And as an industry that took off over the course of the baby boomers' lifetimes, its evolution is mirrored on a macro level, the average cruise passenger's embrace of hedonism. While cruises are in the profitable business of facilitating consumeristic wet dreams, they do so while masking the ugly realities necessary to shuttle millions around the seven seas, without forgetting to put a nightly chocolate on their bed. Consider the staggering environmental damage alone. In 2022, 63 Carnival cruise ships emitted 43% more sulfur oxide than all 300 million cars in Europe. Sulfur oxides are pollutants that, along with harming human respiration, can also cause acid rain. Fuel guzzlers by design, even a mid-sized cruise ship burns up to 150 tons of fuel per day, which is as much as 1 million automobiles. All the better to power your palm tree light show. And that's not to mention the sheer amount of liquid waste produced. There's thousands of gallons of sewage water for each ship. Urbina notes that it can cost larger cruise ships more than $150,000 to properly dispose of this waste, and adds that many cruise lines simply prefer not to. They use magic pipes to just silently flush it out into the ocean. On the rare occasions that cruise lines are penalized for this, the fines are just laughably low. This behavior is, of course, mirrored on a small scale by passengers having a little too much fun. But on a larger scale, it also matches the way baby boomers have treated the planet. People over 60 accounted for nearly a third of greenhouse gas emissions in 2015, researchers say. Now, when it comes to the audacity of cruise ships literally creating a sea of shit, if you're wondering, why isn't anybody harshly regulating this stuff, you know? This doesn't seem fair. I'm really sorry that you haven't realized how the world works yet. But it's actually because of a thing called flags of convenience, which lets shipping vessels register under foreign flags. Now today, around 90% of all US commercial vessels visiting US ports fly non-US flags, often from developing nations like Liberia or Panama, countries that, by sheer coincidence, have lax tax policies, nearly non-existent labor or environmental laws, and minimal infrastructure to enforce regulations. Now, countries eager to earn registration fees off these vessels compete to create the most attractive taxation and regulation conditions, to the point where cruise ships are hardly monitored at all. Now, on face, it's absurd that an industry mostly owned by Americans, carrying majority American passengers, is operating like this. It also costs Americans hundreds of millions of dollars in lost tax revenue annually, with cruise ships barely contributing to our coffers while benefiting from millions of dollars worth of public investment in state-run port security. Wow, avoiding paying taxes while still wanting to reap some benefits and feel safe and protected sounds like some people I know, because indeed the baby boomer generation has famously been enamored with cutting taxes while enjoying government benefits like Social Security, even as they control more wealth than ever before, all amounting to what writer Bruce Gibney calls generational plunder. Oh, I get it, they're like pirates. That's why they like the cruise ships. Now, this is partially why one billionaire is building a $10.4 billion luxury cruise line just for baby boomers, saying they're the richest group we have around. In short, the powerful cruise oligopoly is able to dangle its tourism carrot to bully countries into artificially subsidizing its operating costs, while also benefiting from those nations' investments in infrastructure and security. Massive cruise line profits are thus less the sign of a well-run industry than one run without financial obligations or oversight. Much like how the rules don't apply to passengers, the rules don't apply to cruise lines either. This further cements the idea of cruises as a collective fantasy, one in which, due to long-standing economic and political forces, a select few companies get to enjoy massive profits, and a select demographic of wealthy Westerners get to enjoy luxurious paradise while the rest of the world pays the price. Because, as Scott Galloway argues, the fun-loving boomer is only afforded this kind of luxury because of economic conditions that have coalesced to make them the wealthiest demographic on the planet, amounting for more than half of all American wealth, despite making up just 20% of the population. And as they've been sitting pretty on trillions of dollars of fast appreciating home property values, they've been voting for and enacting the kinds of political and economic policies which have ensured that, among other things, you and I will never be able to retire, much less own a home. And they've also helped ensure that child labor is an increasingly normal obligation for lower class kids. Also, they've kept it so that CEOs are paid just a gazillion times more than their hardest working employees. It's not uncommon to see headlines remarking that the boomers are just cruising away your inheritance. Now, on an individual level, that can feel like it's maybe a harsh way to think about your nearest and dearest enjoying some fun in the sun. But on a macro level, the boomer cruise lifestyle is indeed frittering away American wealth acquired due in part to dumb luck and in part to systemic strategies like slashing tax rates. And in the meanwhile, the wealthiest class of people in history is then using that money to exploit the property, resources, and environmental health of the Caribbean islands. And just as cruises explain the failure of former Caribbean colonies to ever realize true financial independence, they also explain the generational downward mobility that leaves you still having to ask mom and dad for help with rent sometimes. But hey, while we might not be able to afford cruises or our own apartments or healthcare or our car payments, we can enjoy happy hour at our local Margaritaville for overpriced burgers and watered down cocktails. I'll see you there. But what do you guys think about all of this? You know, do cruises embody everything wrong with boomers and the American economy? Is the price of paradise too steep to justify? Or is it just so much fun it doesn't matter? I haven't been on a cruise. I don't know. Please tell me what you think. Thank you so much for hanging out. We really appreciate it when you like and comment and subscribe. All these things do a bunch to help the channel. If you want to help the channel a little bit more, you can also go follow us over on Spotify. And if you want to go crazy with it, check out our Patreon. It's the best way for you to support us directly. In the meantime, I'm going to head back up because I guess they're doing some sort of submarine trip that sounds really exciting. So I'll either see you guys next video or never again. Take it easy.